Letting go of the apron strings. A phenomenon of life. This is an audio story written by Red Cardinal Kitchen. The illumination of a dynamic archive. This record observes a familiar phrase often spoken lightly and understood narrowly. It does not attempt to correct language, assign judgment, or prescribe timing. It simply holds a sequence of moments that unfold differently in every life. The story preserves how connection changes shape across years, how closeness and independence coexist, and how bonds persist without requiring explanation. What follows is offered as observation, not instruction. There are certain expressions that linger in common speech long after their meanings have thinned. They are said casually, sometimes kindly, sometimes with humor, often without pause. Apron strings is one of them. It suggests a moment that should have passed, a closeness that should have loosened, a leaving that should have already occurred. Yet life rarely moves according to the tidy expectations embedded in language. In the early years, the world is small and carefully arranged. The kitchen holds a particular gravity, not because of its walls, but because of what happens there each day. Meals are prepared, hands are washed, stories are told without being framed as stories. A child learns safety not through explanation, but through repetition, through the steady presence of a mother moving through familiar tasks. The apron is part of that landscape, fabric brushed against small shoulders, a place to stand close when the world feels uncertain. It is not named as comfort, but it is known as such. At this stage, closeness is not a choice. It is simply how life works. The child returns instinctively, not out of fear, but because belonging feels natural. The mother's movements form a quiet language, one that teaches care without instruction. The rhythm of daily life establishes trust, and the child absorbs it without effort. Nothing about this arrangement feels temporary. There is no awareness yet of departure, only presence. Time, however, has its own momentum. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, attention begins to widen. The child notices what exists beyond the door, beyond the familiar rooms. Curiosity grows alongside confidence. The apron strings, once close and tangible, begin to lengthen without anyone touching them. Distance is introduced not as loss, but as possibility. The mother senses this shift long before it is spoken, recognizing that growth has begun its quiet work. Letting go does not arrive as a single moment. It unfolds through small permissions. A child makes a decision without asking. They solve a problem alone, then return not for approval, but to share what has already happened. The connection remains, but its function changes. Guidance becomes less immediate, more internal. Trust replaces supervision. What once required proximity now relies on memory and instinct. There are moments when the change feels sharper than expected. The first time the child does not come home at the usual hour. The first holiday spent elsewhere. The first challenge handled without calling. These moments are not failures of connection, but signs of transformation. The apron strings loosen further, not because they are cut, but because they are no longer needed to hold things together. From the outside, these transitions often invite commentary. Words are offered easily, sometimes without malice, sometimes without thought. Phrases like, "time to let go," or "still tied to home," are spoken as if they describe a universal path. What remains unseen are the countless variables shaping each life. Circumstances, responsibilities, loss, culture, and temperament all influence how closeness is lived. No one timeline fits them all. For some, remaining close is not reluctance, but necessity. Care is shared. Support moves in both directions. Bonds deepen not because growth has stalled, but because life has asked for presence. To mistake proximity for immaturity is to overlook the strength required to stay when leaving would be easier. Independence does not always announce itself through distance. As adulthood settles in, the connection shifts again. Advice is offered sparingly, often only when requested. Silence becomes a form of respect. The grown child carries lessons forward without realizing it, repeating gestures once observed, practicing patience learned long ago. The apron is no longer visible, yet its influence appears in daily rhythms, in how care is extended to others. There are returns, too. Moments when the grown child stands once more in the familiar kitchen, noticing details that once blended into the background. The worn edge of a counter, the quiet efficiency of movement. These visits are no longer about shelter, but recognition. The past is acknowledged without being revisited. What remains is continuity. Over time, the teasing language loses its authority. The phrase, letting go, begins to feel incomplete. Nothing was ever held in a way that required release. What existed was a living bond, flexible enough to change without breaking. The apron strings were never meant to restrain. They were meant to teach how connection can persist without possession. Closeness, when understood without judgment, reveals itself as adaptive rather than static. It expands and contracts according to need. It offers support without erasing autonomy. It allows space without severance. This balance is rarely visible from the outside, yet it governs countless lives quietly and effectively. As years pass, the bond continues its quiet evolution. Roles shift. Dependence gives way to mutual regard. The mother watches not to guide, but to witness. The child, now fully grown, understands that independence was never about absence. It was about carrying what mattered forward. There is no ceremony marking this transition. No announcement that the apron strings have loosened enough. The change is evident only in retrospect, in the realization that love has remained intact without requiring constant proximity. What once felt like holding has become remembering. The world continues to offer its commentary, its shorthand explanations. Yet those living inside these bonds rarely need them. They recognize that growth does not look the same in every life. They know that connection and autonomy are not opposites, but companions. Eventually, the story circles forward. The grown child ties their own apron. A small hand reaches for it. The cycle does not repeat exactly. It adapts. What is passed on is not instruction, but posture. Care learned quietly finds new expression. In this way, the apron strings were never about delay. They were about continuity. They marked a place of origin, not a point of failure. They taught how love can remain present without insisting on closeness. Distance, when it arrives, does so without erasing what came before. Nearness, when it remains, does not prevent what comes next. Both exist within a larger pattern shaped by circumstance rather than expectation. What endures is not the fabric, but what was learned beside it. Safety, attention, care practiced daily. These things do not vanish when space appears. They travel forward, woven into lives that continue to unfold. The phrase that once invited teasing grows quiet. Its simplicity no longer fits the complexity it attempted to name. What remains is a recognition that lives move at different speeds, and that understanding requires patience rather than judgment. The apron hangs where it always did, no longer worn, yet never discarded. It has fulfilled its purpose without needing ceremony. Its presence is symbolic now, not functional, marking a history rather than a demand. The connection persists, invisible and durable. It stretches across time without strain. It allows distance without rupture. It holds memory without insisting on return. In the end, letting go was never the point. Learning how to remain connected without holding too tightly was. The apron strings did not need cutting. They simply taught how love changes shape and continues. This story does not resolve a debate. It acknowledges a process. What has been observed here is not a rule, but a pattern that adapts quietly to the lives it touches. Some bonds do not announce their strength. They persist through ordinary days, altered roles, and unspoken understanding. They remain present, not because they must, but because they were built to endure. This record is preserved as part of the Red Cardinal Kitchen archive. It is held for continuity rather than explanation. Some records exist to remember posture, not to teach lessons. Thank you for visiting our channel and spending time with our work. Red Cardinal Kitchen, the illumination of a dynamic archive.